Hi everyone and welcome to our second art tutorial video. Today we'll be using HB pencil, a 2B pencil and a 6B pencil, which I'm about to hold up. The 2B pencil is darker than the HB but not as dark as the 6B, so that's that one there. And then the 6B pencil is darker than the HB and the 2B. Basically they get softer as the numbers go up. We've also got an eraser and a sharpener and a glass, and then we're good to go. So I'll start sketching off with the HB pencil. What we're going to do today, because we're doing a sort of drawing from an object that's easy to find in your house, we're going to start with really basic shapes. So all objects or anything you draw starts as like bare bones, really basic shapes, usually like circles, triangles, cylinders, that sort of stuff. So for this glass, I can see that up the very top of the glass is a circle, so I'm trying to draw that circle first. And then as you look further down the glass, especially because of the angle I'm sitting at, because I'm sort of at a bit of a different angle than what you're looking at in this video, you can see that there's another circle below this top circle, and that's like the circumference of the bottom of the glass. So I'll start doing that in a second. So I've started with that top kind of guiding circle first, and then when I do the circle at the bottom of the glass, which I'm doing now, it's going to be a little bit wider and a lot bigger than the top circle. So it just you're kind of imitating, I guess, a cone shape without doing the top of the cone, just because that's how the glass is shaped. I actually ended up doing it a little bit too narrow, but I still think it works out okay, so it doesn't have to be perfect, but this is just the basic guidelines for how you might start with drawing a glass like this. So to get the circles looking fairly circular, you can see that I'm doing like really little strokes. And then as the circle starts looking a bit more like how I want it to look, I will start applying a bit more pressure with the pencil just to sort of solidify those circular lines. If you do a circle straight away and just go in with one harsh line, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to get a good looking circle. So yeah, we're going in quite lightly initially. And what you'll see there is I'm just sort of showing you where those circles were. So you can see there's a circle in the bottom of the glass. There's a circle a bit higher, which is sort of that fuller part of the glass. And then there's a circle right at the top. And then they're joined together by two lines that go straight down. So just getting those really basic shapes initially. And then I'll be adding the bottom of the glass and just sort of curving around along the same curve line as that circle, and just kind of adding that little bit at the bottom, which you can kind of see from this angle, although I don't think I quite got it exactly right. I think maybe the corners or the edges should have been pulled in a bit more instead of being as flat as they are, but this is sort of like the basic sketch for this glass. And these sort of exercises are basically giving you an idea of how to see those basic shapes in everyday objects, and it just makes things a lot easier to draw, a lot easier to find those proportions. I've gone through this quite quickly, so the proportions that you're seeing here aren't going to be 100% accurate, but it's just an exercise to help you get used to sort of drawing from objects that you can sort of see in front of you, and it's just a really good way to practice. So what I'm doing now is rubbing out those guiding lines that you were seeing me do before when I was doing those really light strokes. So rubbing out these lines just helps me get a better idea of what that fundamental sketch is going to look like, and then I will go back over the top with a bit more pressure, just to sort of define those lines so I know where I'm going to be shading and stuff like that in the next section. So I'm just lightly rubbing out or lightly erasing all those guiding lines, and then I'll go back over the top and make them more defined. I will say that when you're erasing, it's probably better if you have like a brush, or even I think a feather works if you have a feather, to get rid of those sort of like little bits that come off of you as you erase, just because when you wipe it away with your hand like I did, it can move the graphite around and then you can get a lot of smudging and stuff. You'll see later that I rub out quite a bit of smudging. So that's just something to keep note of, I guess. So I'm just defining these lines now so I know exactly where I'm going to be shading, and I can just do a bit more refining of that shape of the glass. You may have seen then that I laid my pencil down as well. I was just checking to see if those straight lines were matching up as level on each side of the glass, because the glass is obviously quite symmetrical. So just trying to get those lines reasonably exact if I can. It's hard with circles, and if you're drawing circles freehand, it's quite tricky to get them looking right and to get the curves sort of the same on both sides. So I guess if you had a circular item that you could use for the top circle and the bigger circular item for the bottom circle, it would probably look a lot more symmetrical than maybe this looks, because I'm just doing it freehand. Whatever suits. I would recommend giving it a go freehand if you can, just to get used to drawing circles and drawing these kinds of shapes. It's really good practice for any sort of drawing that you're doing later on. So I'm just defining these lines a bit further, just doing a couple of the finer details. Like you can see there's a slight lip on the glass. It's probably a bit tricky to see here, but from the angle that I'm looking at, there is a slight lip on there. So I'm just going around and extending that circle out a little bit to create that illusion that there's a edge on the glass. And then just extending those sides down, because when I put the edge on, it kind of went out a bit far. And just sort of defining those bottom circles as well. You can see that using this sort of circle method, it really reiterates the fact that it's a three-dimensional object. It looks like you're looking down into the glass, which is what you want. Like you can see that there's the front of the glass and you can see there's the back of the glass. And it just helps in terms of shading as well, because when you start shading the front and back sections of the glass, you can easily differentiate between what should be going in the foreground and what should maybe be going towards the background, and sort of shading according to that. So just some final touches to this initial sketch. And I'm just doing a couple of lines there just to sort of get it in my mind that that's the bottom of the glass and it's curving around towards the back. And there you go, initial sketch, ready. So I'm going to start shading now, and I'm going to begin using the 2B pencil, because the 2B pencil isn't as dark as the 6B. It'll let me sort of establish those areas that I want shadow to be in without creating them, or without drawing them in too dark initially. So I'm just starting at the top just to get a feel for how I want the shadows to look. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of a section first just to kind of blunt the pencil a little bit, because the pencil, I did do it quite sharp, so I'm using that sharper point on the finer details up the top because they need to be quite precise. And then when the pencil gets a bit more blunt, which you can kind of feel after a bit of time, you can tell when it's when the graphite's sort of worn down a little bit, I will start shading in some bigger areas with that softer sort of edge. And so you can see I'm just mapping out the shadows now. So I'm putting in very light shading where I think the shadows are going to go. With glasses, it can be kind of tricky because there are so many different colors and different shades when you're looking at a glass, especially if it has a lot of reflection. So sometimes I find it easier to just kind of pick out the shades that are really dominant, and then you can kind of draw around them a little bit and kind of try and keep a similar look to how you're shading in terms of like just really reiterating those quite obvious dark areas and then kind of building around them in a way that looks natural, I guess. It's kind of odd to explain, but unless you have heaps and heaps and heaps of time, I would say if you're just doing some sketching, just pick out whatever shadows are really, really obvious and focus on those in the first instance, and then you can do some more detailed stuff later on. So that's what I'm doing in this case, and I'm using the 2B pencil because it allows me to put in these shades and map out where everything's going to go without committing too much to those darker shadows yet. It also gives the drawing a bit of variance. So when you start putting the darker shadows in, you're not going to colour completely over those lighter ones that you've done with the 2B pencil, and it creates that different sort of grading of shadow. And so you can see I'm kind of going over some of the lines in the back. That's because the part that I'm colouring in, I want it to look like it's coming in front of the part at the back, because that'll be like the front of the glass, and the same with the parts at the back. I'm just trying to keep that differentiation between the front of the glass and the back of the glass as much as possible. Like, it's kind of hard. If you're following the shadows, it should kind of work out. Even if you think it looks kind of weird, just kind of stick to it, and sometimes it ends up looking okay. Other times it looks like a complete mess and you just have to start again, which is fine. It's all practice, and you kind of get used to picking out what bits should go where. So I can see when I'm looking at the glass, the bottom of it is quite round, and there's a lot of different shades in there. So I'm going to do most of the bottom of the glass with the 6B pencil in this darker shade. So I've sort of mapped out kind of where I want my shadows to go. They're pretty loose at the moment. And then I'm going to go in with this darker pencil and really sort of start defining some of these shadows, especially at the bottom of the glass where most of the deeper shadows are. And that's just going to work to heighten that sense that it's three-dimensional. So I'm doing a bit more detailed shading with this darker pencil, and I'm sort of almost creating these lines. I'm trying to follow the contour of the glass and keep my shading curved along the same angle that the circle is. So that just works to sort of create that illusion that it's all following this one curve instead of being like straight shadows all the way across. They're all curved shadows. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if it does, but you can kind of see that as I'm drawing, I'm following that circular line to keep that illusion that it's a glass and the front of the glass is coming towards us. I'm also trying to keep the darker shadows towards the front, just because when I'm looking at that glass from the angle that I'm looking at it from, the darker shadows are all closer to me, so I'm just trying to reiterate that as well. It creates that illusion of depth. I also sometimes will add just a singular line, just because I think that helps with establishing that the glass is circular instead of just doing straight sort of lines across the top. And I'm only really focusing on the parts of the glass that I can see are quite dark. And I sort of try and work from the bottom of the glass up. It just helps in terms of knowing which part you're shading and when, but you'll see that sometimes I get a bit distracted and I'll do another part. So sometimes I can be a bit haphazard in the way that I shade. I'll get interested in a board of a section and then want to start doing another one. So yeah, sometimes it doesn't quite make logical sense, but I would recommend sort of starting at a point, maybe either from the top or from the bottom, and working your way down so you can keep track of the parts that you've done and the parts that you haven't. And you can see as I'm sort of doing the back of the glass, I'm not doing those shadows as dark because when I'm looking at it, the ones closer to me are a lot darker. And then I also am aware that there's a pane of glass in front of those shadows at the back. So naturally, that glass pane is going to sort of mean that those shadows are not as intense as the ones that are closer. They're sort of dulled a little bit. And I basically just keep going until I'm reasonably happy with the product. Because this is quite a quick sketch, I'm not taking too much time to do this, so it's probably not as detailed as I guess it could be, but drawing glasses and stuff like this with a lot of reflections that are kind of overwhelming to look at when you first look at them can be really good practice in terms of figuring out how to shade and figuring out, you know, what shadows are important, I guess. When I draw, I just try and focus on the things that I think are the most influential to establishing the shape of something. And then I'll kind of tend to ignore or just sort of fill in the rest. I'm not too fussed about being perfect. I tend to go quite quick and can be quite messy. But that's sort of the way that I prefer to draw. And, you know, in time, as you keep practicing, you'll find things that work for you and discover certain ways that you like doing things and discover certain styles that you like doing things in. So, yeah, the way you draw sort of changes over time as you get comfortable and start discovering what you like. I use the 6B for quite a bit of this drawing. It might even be beneficial to go up to an 8B for some of the darker sections just to really reiterate that difference in colour. But I found that the 6B was pretty good in terms of really emphasising those darker shadows, but still keeping the lighter shades in there. And just working on sort of the differences between the front and the back of the glass now. And I guess in my mind, I'm trying to picture that, or I'm trying to keep in mind that this part that I'm drawing now is the back. And then as I go down, you know, this part is the front, and just trying to keep that three-dimensional image in my head, because I think that helps with the overall product. When you're picturing things as three-dimensional objects, you can start drawing them in a way that really emphasizes that. If you're seeing it all as 2D all the time, it's a bit harder to sort of get that three-dimensional illusion, I guess. And glasses are really fun. You can always put something in it if you wanted to. Like you could draw something in this glass. Pretty flower, or I don't know, you could put anything in there. But it's just sort of the starting point for doing a bit of practice and practicing shading, practicing drawing from life, and getting those basics sort of down. And you can see I'm going in further now, still with the 6B pencil. I'm just applying more pressure, and I am really emphasizing some of those darker spots just to create that variation between the light and the dark in the glass. Glasses can be really hard as well because it's really easy to overdo it. I did actually do more than what I'm doing now. And I found that the darker I was sort of making the shadows and the more shading I was putting in, the less that I felt like the illusion was successful. So I will say there's like a point where it's good to just sort of stop, take a break, have a look at it, take a step back. Because sometimes, even though it might seem more accurate to put more shading and more detail in, sometimes it actually looks better with less. So I kind of wish that I left it where I leave it in this video instead of going that sort of step further and doing the darker colors, because looking at this, I actually really like the more minimal kind of approach instead of the overly kind of heavy-handed. But it's all personal preference as well. It's all trial and error. And there you go. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.